Okay, we're going to go ahead and start the integumentary system. So you should have out your notes. And what you should know is that the system, for the most part, what we're going to be focusing on is the skin, but there's a few accessory organs as well that we're going to talk about. So here's sort of a cross-section of the skin, and I'm going to go ahead and highlight the things that you will need to know. So for one, you need to know, obviously, where the hair is, and then the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous layer. I'll talk more about this later, but epi, that prefix means on top, and dermis, you see that term, think of a dermatologist, that's just, they study the skin. So this is the skin that is on top. The dermis is literally in the middle, and sub, think of a submarine underneath, so that's the layer underneath the skin. Alright, so the other thing that you need to know, we do need to know the sweat gland, and you probably know that those would produce sweat. And the sebaceous gland is a pretty important one, so I'm going to go ahead and come over here with that. So the sebaceous gland, think of these guys as they're the ones that would secrete or produce oily matter, and that oily matter, you need to know that term is called sebum. So that is on the outside, or that's what's produced and is goes to the outside of the skin, and that's since it's oily, it's prominent in animals, particularly mammals. That's what lubricates them. It could make them or have a waxy outerproof, waterproof layer to their skin. So think of like a I don't know, like an otter, a sea otter. They can be in really cold water, but that sebum that's produced helps to keep them waterproof, that oily substance. And another thing, since they produce that oil, something else we've all heard of is acne. And so acne occurs when the outlet, or what's going out of the subcutaneous gland, so it's an outlet to the gland, it's plugged. So that sebum starts to accumulate in the follicle. So the more plugged it is, if that plugging continues, it can cause bacterial growth, it can cause like an inflammatory response. That is what we call, well, it's a lesion, but that's what we call a pimple. So kind of understand that it's not an overproduction necessarily of that oil, it's that that oily matter is clogged, and that is what can cause or lead to acne or pimples. Okay, so that's the sebaceous gland. The hair root, you would probably know where that is. And the adipose tissue, adipose, we learned that in the last chapter about tissues. Just remember that's fat. Okay, so it's kind of an overview of the big things that you need to know for skin. Okay, and we know from last chapter that it's one of the largest organs, especially by weight. So there are organs obviously in your body, but that's the biggest one by weight. And so we already know what homeostasis means, right? That's maintaining stable internal conditions. So how would the skin help to do that? Number one, it helps regulate body temperature. And so that's where sweating comes in. You know that this is what comes out of the skin. And then another thing, it slows water loss from deeper tissues, which would cause dehydration. So it's also helping maintain homeostasis. It houses or like holds sensory receptors. So things like nerves, if you were to put your hand on a, hot, anything, a hot plate or a hot oven, there's sensory organs that are sensory receptors that are there that's going to tell you, I need to pull my, my hand away or it will burn. So that's the sensory receptors. Another thing is that they might make biochemicals. When you see this term bio, just think life. These things are necessary for life. The only one I think we're going to talk about is vitamin D, which I'll get to later. And the next thing that they can do, that the skin does, is that it excretes we're going to call small amounts of waste. And that waste, it could be salts, it could be, what else? Extra water, excess water, something else. And then sweat would be something else, that waste. Okay? So those are 5 main things. Just kind of understand what each one of those means. Okay, so there's 3 major regions. I had mentioned this before. So one is so when it says superficial, that means, you know, closest to the outside environment. The middle, the dermis, and the deepest, remember, sub, under, cutaneous. Okay. So that's the deepest region of the skin. Okay, so the epidermis, it functions to protect underlying or the tissues that are underneath, because we already remember there's different types of tissues. So we're talking about the outside tissue, right? So it functions to protect the tissues that are underneath it. It could be from excessive water loss, again maintaining homeostasis. It could be an injury to the outside layer. And this we know from last chapter already. It's made of stratified squamous is what we call it, epithelium. I kind of remember what those terms mean. So remember, if it's stratified, it's multiple layers, and squamous, remembering it's that sort of flattened tissue. Okay, so that's the epidermis. Continuing with epidermis, the things that are specialized, so I'll go ahead and start here. Melanocytes. These are specialized cells that produce melanin, which is a dark pigment. That is what actually gives you skin color. Okay, so it absorbs UV radiation, and that, if it absorbs the UV radiation, that's what's going to hopefully and usually prevents mutations, which could lead to cancer. And they're found in the deepest portion of the epidermis, at the very, very lowest portion. Okay, so here we are. Skin color is a result of melanin. So people have about the same number of melanocytes, which we already said before what it does. So we basically all have the same amount of those, but what's actually giving us the difference in skin color is the amount of melanin that those actual melanocytes produce. So freckles and pigmented moles, just, you know, freckles and pigmented moles, they are just local, what they call, accumulations of just a bunch of melanin in one place, basically. And that's genetically determined, meaning it's passed on from information from both your mom and your dad. So there are things that environmental, so things that you're exposed to, and then physiological. This has more to do with a genetic component. So tan could be caused, again, by exposure to sun, so that's more of an environmental factor. Red, like when you're sunburned, that's something else that could be caused by an environmental factor. Blue, it's not saying that your actual skin is blue, which there have been cases of people being blue we might talk about later, but that's cyanosis. If you have too much yellow, bilirubin, okay, and this has something to do with our jaundice in babies, which we'll probably talk about later also, but they're not producing enough. And then orange is called by carotene. You think of carotene, I think of carrots, which are orange. So it's a whole, when you say skin color, there's a whole bunch of factors that go into, or a whole bunch of colors that that go into your actual skin color. So the function of melanin is, that's what actually gives skin color. And remember, factors, there are environmental factors, there's genetic factors, there's physiological factors, but think back to that video, that TED Ed talk that you should have watched. And that's kind of the basic information that you need to know about melanin and skin color. So we're going to get to the dermis, but I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and stop now. So make sure you have all those notes, and then we'll continue with the next video.